Welcome to all of you. I am Samantha Schartman, Executive Director of the Marconi Society, and I'm so pleased to see you at the Decade of Digital Inclusion event series. Today, we're kicking off the third and final session in our virtual track, the 6G Summit on Connecting the Unconnected. For those of you who are meeting us for the first time, the Marconi Society is a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that the opportunities of the network are available to everyone on the planet. Our chair is Vint Cerf, one of the creators of the internet and leading visionaries of our time. The event series that you're joining today brings together leaders in technology, policy, and digital inclusion. Our goal is to create conversations and collaborations that will help us bring the un- and underconnected online in a way that's accessible, affordable, safe, and engaging. I'm also proud to welcome our moderator today, the incredible Andrea Goldsmith, who is our newest Marconi Fellow. Let me switch sides here. We are also proud and honored to have some incredible sponsors for this event as well, who are as dedicated as we are to ensuring digital inclusion. I particularly would like to acknowledge our top sponsors, Cisco, Crown Castle, and Sigrid and Vint Cerf. I also want to thank ISOC for making this particular track available via streaming. Hold on. But that's not all. Oh, whoopsie. I think we have, sorry, I went right past it. But that is not all. We actually have more sponsors than that. Due to the generosity of these sponsors, we are allowed to offer tickets for our entire 6-week event series featuring over 75 experts and 17 sessions for only $49 for the general public and $25 for students. So if you have not yet registered, I hope you will today. You can go over to our website, marconisociety.org/decade to do so. So before we get started, I'll remind you that there are icons on the right side of your screen for chat and questions. Now, please share your questions through the session and upvote those that you want prioritized. Now, I'm going to turn this over to our professor, Mohammed Slim Alouni of KAUST, who will kick off our session.
So I'm not sure that Slim Alouni is kicking off the session. I think I am actually kicking off the session. So I want to, no worries, Samantha. I want to provide my warmest welcome to everybody online that's joining this session on It All Starts with Access. This is the third in a series of panels that we've had to really provide a deep discussion about what is the next generation of connectivity, what is the impact that it's going to have, and how do we ensure that the entire world benefits from broadband access. I think there's no more important time than in the midst of a pandemic where we've seen the importance of connectivity for us to be able to continue to live and work and play and do the things that give us joy, perhaps not as much as if we were all in person. I so wish we were all in person. But in fact, being able to connect remotely and have these kinds of deep discussions is something that broadband connectivity has enabled us to do. So just to set a little bit about the tone of this panel, our first panel, which was an overview of possibilities, that was really very high level to talk about how, if everybody in the world could have broadband access, what would that enable? How would that bring economic opportunities and other opportunities to people in the world that right now do not have that kind of connectivity. The next panel was called From the Middle to the Core. And this was really about the guts of the infrastructure for how we're going to enable broadband access. And now this panel, it's all about access, is really focused on how do we get there? There's economic challenges, there's technical challenges, there's political challenges on everything from governments investing in broadband access to neighborhoods that don't want small cells because they think that they're ugly or that they're dangerous. And so really this panel is focused on how do we bring access to everybody, both the technical challenges as well as all the other challenges. And if we can get there, if we can get to having broadband access for everybody, what would that actually mean? So that is the focus of this panel, and I'm delighted and thrilled to have four amazing panelists that have an incredible breadth of experience and background and passion around this question of how do we provide access to everybody. So the structure of the panel is that I am going to introduce each panelist very briefly. They have incredibly laudable careers and experience and honors and awards, which I don't want to take time to go into, but I encourage you to read their bios. So I will introduce each panelist. They will go through a few minutes of opening remarks to kind of set the stage of their perspective on this question of access. And after that, I would welcome your questions. I have a few questions that I'm thinking to pose to the panelists, but actually the best part of a panel is to get questions from the audience that spur us to think in new ways and catch us unprepared with the answers. And I think that that's one of the most fun ways to do a panel and can lead to incredible dynamics among the panelists. So I really want to encourage the audience to send in questions. So please do so during the opening remarks or at any time. So again, I have the great honor of this remarkable set of panelists. I'm going to start with Brian Barrett. He is the connectivity software organization leader at Facebook, which is obviously a company that would like to connect everybody on the planet. He has previous experience at Loon, as does one of our other panelists. Loon, I think, was one of the most and is one of the most ambitious experiments to bring connectivity in new ways. And Brian has a whole host of other experience. And so I'm really looking forward to him kicking off this panel to tell us his views about access. Brian, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, everyone, for welcoming me here. Just to start off and tell you a little bit about the organization I'm with and kind of our perspective on connectivity. It's a group at Facebook that maybe some don't know exists. I think when people think of Facebook, the company, they think of the Facebook app, they think of Instagram and WhatsApp or Oculus. But there's actually a group in Facebook called Facebook Connectivity, whose mission is to connect the unconnected. And this group's mission is to do so in a net neutral way, right? We're not providing access only to Facebook products. We're providing access to the entire internet because that's good for the world and good for Facebook's business. So to start off, we spend a lot of time in our group looking at the global state of connectivity and what we can do to improve it. So to start off with just like a couple stats, today, 57% of households are connected to the internet, and there's still about 3.3 billion people lacking internet access. So some good news, the percentage of those connected households that have a 4G mobile broadband connection or something of equivalent speed is increasing slowly from 43% to 59% of connections worldwide by 2025. A bit of a side note, 5G connectivity to households is projected to just be 15% of all projected households by 2025. So still a ways to go there. But it's a very an important thing, not just for business, but for the world, to try to connect these 3.3 billion unconnected people and try to improve the connections of those that have internet access. So according to the Internet Inclusivity Index, 77% of people, when they get internet access and they didn't have it before, are using it to learn job-related skills, 74% to discover new job opportunities, and 60% of them use that new internet connection to help pursue an education. But when you look at the challenge of connecting the unconnected in the world, I think this map is one that I like to reference a lot to people that are trying to understand the problem of connected and unconnected, because it really captures two big important factors of the problem, which are population density and income. So population density on the Earth, is shown in this map, spans 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. So you have some places on Earth that only have single digits of people per square kilometer. And you have places on Earth that have tens of thousands of people per square kilometer. This is one of the main reasons why there's no one-size-fits-all solution to the problem of global connectivity. I like to think of wireless transmitters almost like a flashlight that you could hold above this map. If you had it at a very low altitude, that same transmission and its amount of energy would cover a very small area, but the amount of energy per unit area would be quite high. And that's the kind of solution you need in dense population areas, which is provided well by cell towers. But as you get into more rural areas, it's just not economical to put a cell tower in markets that only have tens of people per square kilometer. And that's where you look at raising the altitude of that transmission so that that same amount of energy is spread over a wider area. Now you sacrifice capacity per square kilometer, but that's okay because there's fewer people there per square kilometer. So having global connectivity solved by a combination of towers, high altitude platforms, low Earth orbit satellites, mid Earth orbit satellites, and geostationary orbiting satellites is really all necessary, because it's kind of natural that we would need 5 orders of magnitude of altitude to solve for 5 orders of magnitude of population density on Earth. The other big factor to think about is income. So you can see that an income of $12,196 a year puts you in the upper quartile of income earners on the planet. And that's one of the reasons that solving robust and abundant internet access for everyone requires more economical solutions. So at Facebook Connectivity, we're developing solutions and giving them away to the world in the telecom industry, often through open source projects, through subsidizing infrastructure projects, and by inventing novel hardware and product solutions, and also partnering with others in consortiums. So a couple of things that I'm personally involved in. One of them is an effort to build a completely open source and free cellular packet core, so that an relatively inexpensive $200 box put next to a cell tower and some free software from the internet is enough to start your own cellular network. Another project I'm involved in is some partnerships that we're doing through an industry group called the Telecom Infra Project, where we're working to help transform the satellite industry to adopt some brand new standards that are coming out of the cellular community that will make it more affordable and easier for satellites and high altitude platforms to connect to regular cell phones in your pocket. So those are 2 of the projects I'm personally involved in that I'll hope to have a chance to talk about later in the panel. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was a wonderful kickoff. And believe me, we will be talking about satellites and terrestrial and what role they play, because I think that is a very important part of looking forward. And I'm sure Helka will touch on that as well. So next up in our opening remarks, we have Edward John Oughton, who's an assistant professor of geography and information science at George Mason University. And you might wonder, well, how does that relate to wireless communication or connectivity? And in fact, John has a fascinating perspective, because his focus is really on digital infrastructure around the world and where we've been, what 5G is doing for that, and then what is ahead. And so his research and his perspective is incredibly broad and interdisciplinary. And so I'm going to turn it over to John for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So my background more recently has been focusing on building open source software to assess the engineering economics of digital infrastructure. And it's really working at that kind of 1 kilometer scale that Brian just showed on the global picture. And I'm able to basically quantify potential demand at that local level, and then also develop on the supply side least cost network solutions, so we can then start to evaluate different kind of techno-economic strategies for connecting the unconnected in many of these different countries. And I think that last map that Brian showed really kind of captured the key issues that we have, which are population density and low income. Okay, so this is going to make it incredibly challenging to actually deploy any of these strategies in many of these areas that are still unconnected. Most of those users are predominantly, in my opinion, in the African continent and in Asia, in those low-income countries. And that's an incredibly challenging place to actually deploy, particularly given the context that 5G over the last 5 or 6 years, in my opinion, really hasn't done very much for coverage, okay? So a lot of those technologies that we've seen evolving through the standardization is moving towards millimeter wave, small cells. They're great technologies, higher order MIMO, but the reality is that a lot of these aren't going to provide the sort of economics that enables us to actually deploy in really challenging areas, okay? So the average revenue per user in some of those more rural, low-income countries may only be 20 cents a week being topped up. That's less than potentially $1 of US per month. And that really doesn't provide us with what we need to even deploy the sort of civil engineering capacity just to deploy cells, okay? So remember, maybe only 20% of the cost might actually be on the electronics portion that we focus on in electrical engineering, but then 80% could be on basically cement, getting materials to the site. And that's where a lot of the cost structure is essentially going to be going, as well as on things like spectrum fees and taxation. I think reproducibility within academia is a huge issue at the moment, and that's because there really aren't many kind of openly shared code bases for many of the technologies that we're actually focusing on. I think this really matters because I would like to see more independent assessment of the kind of the economics for those candidate 6G technologies. So I know Andrea's asked me before, why would 6G be any different? And I think my opinion is that we really need a use case which focuses just on low-cost connectivity. In 5G, it seemed as if we had all of these technologies standardized and about to be rolled out, at least through non-standalone. And essentially, there hadn't been that sort of comparative analytical approach to look at what the cost dynamics would be. And I'm still very skeptical that many of those technologies are actually going to help in very kind of rural or remote locations. So I'm still skeptical on virtualization being a good approach based on the fact that you've got very little existing infrastructure. And then finally, I'm just going to close off and say that in many of these countries that we're focusing on, these low-income countries, telecoms is essentially a cash cow, okay? So there's not an industrial base that you can tax. Spectrum auctions are seen as a way to extract revenue so that governments have money to spend on things like housing projects or just basic sanitation. And the reality is that that's a perfectly logical way to kind of approach this, given the situations in many of these countries. But we also need to be emphasizing that if you want to suck money out of the sector, there's going to be less for infrastructure investment, and therefore that's going to kind of push out that target that we have. So within the UN Sustainability Goals, Target 9C focuses on universal broadband, ideally by 2030 for everyone in the globe. And the key part within there is affordable. Okay, so we need this to be affordable. And ultimately, if you're sucking the spectrum and the tax revenues out of the sector, there's going to be less money to kind of achieve that goal. And I've really been trying hard to kind of emphasize that to the places that our analytics have been going over the last couple of years. So with that, I'm going to close and thank you all.
Thank you so much for that wonderful insight. And I couldn't agree with you more. And we are going to touch on these things later. I'm old enough to remember the early days of 2G, where there was competition between what's the first digital cellular system and the Iridium satellites, which were going up and were going to provide broadband connectivity to everyone. And at the time, I thought they were about the same cost at the time, but it was very clear that terrestrial systems are going to drive down the cost a lot more, but they're only going to be built in places where there's a lot of people or a lot of money. I think that question remains, and as we think and dig into the panel about the interplay between terrestrial systems and satellite systems, economics are going to play a big role. How do we connect the next billion when there isn't government resources or personal resources to build those systems in a way that they're actually going to make money? So I think that you're thinking about this question, and I agree, as a technologist and someone who has developed a lot of the technologies behind cellular and Wi-Fi, we don't focus on how do we build really low-cost solutions that are going to, be affordable to the next people. We think about how do we get higher data rates and how do we get more people connecting at those high data rates and for a high cost. So I think it's a super important thing that we need to touch on in this panel, and I promise you that we will. So thank you so much for your wonderful remarks. Next, I'm going to turn to Helka-Lina Määttänen, who is a master researcher at Ericsson. I think that's a wonderful title. I I wish I was a master researcher. I'm just a researcher. But I think it's a terrific title. And she is really has been instrumental along with Ericsson in not only the standardization of the different generations of cellular, but also in implementing them around the world. So Ericsson is one of the key infrastructure companies, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the remarks of their master researcher about how we're going to connect everybody. So go ahead, Helka, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. Yeah, the master researcher is a bit, it's not my chosen title, but the Ericsson, one of Ericsson titles. Anyway, so I work at Ericsson Research. I work as a standardization delegate, and I have been working as a delegate around 7 years, and with the standards over 10 years, and currently I work in Run 2, and for this NTN topic, I have worked for a few years now because it started with a couple of study items in 3GPP, and currently we are specifying the first normative specification in release 17 for enabling the 5G connectivity over the satellites. And there's a lot of issues that needs to be solved due to the mere fact that the satellite is so high up, and also that it is not mounted in any building or any tower. So actually the cell and all the network or part of the network identifiers are now moving. For these Leo constellations, they're moving, and the other cell identities and network identities that are still on the ground are not moving. So something that has never happened before is that cell ID versus G0B ID, the associations change, and tracking ID associations to some core network blocks are changing as the satellites move. And also it changes the UE mobility. As normally when you move with your cell phone, there's a handover when you walk from one cell to another cell. But now you might just be standing still with your cell phone, and there's handovers ongoing because the cells are moving. And then there's this other aspect of this, having these very wide coverage for the cells, that it might cover more than one country, and all the regulations are per country. Especially in Europe, this is an issue where the countries are smaller, and it's easily that the satellite coverage of one cell can at least be on top of two countries, because if you are making a call in one country, your own country, you should be served by the core network of your country and not the neighbor country. But in satellite, that's not always the case, as you might easily hear a cell from the other country. And that this requires some sorting out also outside 3GPP. How do we solve it? How do we enforce that the network actually even knows where the call is being made? And for that, there should be some sort of notion of the UE location. And then, is it reliable enough that the UE just tells the location? Does the network need to verify it? What is the accuracy? And even for the initial preamble, because the cells are so wide, the cell phone cannot just send a preamble without knowing where it is in relation to the satellite because of the huge delay. The UE needs to actually calculate some known timing advance to enable also the other UEs to send preamble so that the network can actually receive it without too much errors. So there's a lot of issues to be solved, but now we are towards the end of the release 17, and by the Q1 22 we should have out the first official specification that supports at least the initial version of satellite communications using the 5G standard. And then going forward, the plans for release 18 is already ongoing, and for sure there's going to be work going forward in release 18. The final decision for that happening in December this year, so what it will contain. specifically. And this should be at least addressing this worry that there's not so much standardization efforts for countries that are not so well developed, where there's not so much users that could pay for the connection. But now at least this one should address that. And we also have this reduced capability work item that actually does specify now for ENA also this reduced capability cheaper chipset possibility. So those two items at least for addressing those worries. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think it's very interesting to think about the interplay of standards with respect to terrestrial systems and satellite systems. So that's another exciting new development that hasn't happened in past generations of 3G, or sorry, of cellular 3GPP. So hopefully we can touch on that as well. I want to, before I return, go to Ken Riordan to bring us home in terms of the opening remarks, I do want to encourage people to send your questions in the chat. I think we've had 3 amazing visions and shared wisdom about some of the questions that we're facing. And so I really encourage you to think about what you want to ask these incredible group of panelists and put them in the chat, and we'll get to them after the next set and the last set of opening remarks, which are from Ken Riordan. Ken has been involved in wireless for a long time. He's head of product management at Loon, which is an Alphabet company. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, when I first heard about Loon, I thought, well, that is a really different way to do connectivity. So hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that. He's also part of the HAPS Alliance, which is the High Altitude Platform Station Alliance. And so hopefully he'll tell us a little bit about that as well. So Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and hello to everyone. I'm sorry that I can't see you. Looking forward to the day when that changes. But like Andrea commented earlier, I think the exciting part of today will be the Q&A. So I'm not going to stand in the way of that for too long. But I would like to share with this group a little bit about the HAPS Alliance, so that you understand the perspective that I will bring as I speak on behalf of the HAPS Alliance today. First, probably a good place to start. Brian used the expression HAPS in his comments. I'm betting there's at least one person out there that doesn't even know what HAPS is. So let me start with that. So it's an acronym. It stands for High Altitude Platform Station, which probably still hasn't told you anything. But in the context of networks and communication connectivity, easiest way to think of HAPS is a floating cell tower. So we all drive down the road and we see these towers with antennas on the top. Imagine that tower took off and found its way to the stratosphere, which is a science fiction sounding word to a lot of us. But the interesting thing about the stratosphere is it's just high enough that it doesn't interfere with commercial air traffic. It's above the weather. And by virtue of it being that high, the opportunity for these wide coverage areas that a few of my colleagues have talked about, that opportunity can be capitalized upon. But at the same time, the stratosphere is much closer to the Earth than outer space. So from a radio performance perspective, you have an opportunity that to date has yet to really be seized by even low Earth orbit satellites. And that's to have a layer of connectivity that can still allow commercial off-the-shelf handsets, mobile devices to connect directly to the network. So it's a really special opportunity. This is what HAPS is about. The HAPS Alliance is a relatively new organization formed not even 2 years ago, started by a group of companies that shared the vision of trying to realize this capability that I spoke of. Today, The organization numbers nearly 50 companies, including many academic organizations that we're very excited about to bring that capability and that perspective into the organization. The goals of the organization are, as you might imagine, ultimately to help accelerate the commercial adoption and to fulfill the promise of this sort of stratospheric layer of network. We focus on regulatory matters, we focus on specifications and technical matters, and of course we focus on just broad education, not only to the public at large, but to regulatory bodies and other agencies that don't yet appreciate the capabilities that the stratosphere and that stratospheric network layer can bring. So I'll be happy to talk more about that as we get into the Q&A. As Andrea mentioned, I have been a part of Alphabet's Loon pursuit. Brian, my fellow panelist, and I shared some time at Loon. We can certainly talk about Loon as well. And if anyone really wants to get into the history of cellular networks, I'm prepared to talk about what came even before Andrea's remarks about 2G. We never used the expression 1G back in the day because we didn't know there would ever be a 2G, but there was once upon a time a first generation cellular. And I have the distinction, I don't know how proud of it I should be, but I've been a part of cellular from 1G to today. So happy to talk about any and all of that and looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. And you know, I also remember 1G. I started graduate school in 1989, so it was just a few years after the first cellular systems rolled out. And I think some of us saw the promise of that, but not everybody. In fact, AT&T went to McKinsey and asked them, you know, should we be investing in this new wireless technology in the mid-'80s? And they were told, no, there'll only be about 1,000 cell phone users worldwide ever. So you really should be investing in fiber optics. So the whole wireless team moved to fiber optics. And then they moved back in the early 90s when it was very clear that cellular was exploding and Wi-Fi was still in the distant future as well. We haven't talked about Wi-Fi, but Wi-Fi is also a key piece of connectivity in some domains, but obviously it has even less reach than cellular and certainly a lot less than satellite. So we hopefully will have time to get into all of those different things. I'm very happy to see the questions rolling in. So I will be getting to your questions. I'm going to try to ask them in an order that gives us a more coherent set of discussion items. But please do continue to send your questions. I'm seeing them all and I will get to them. We have about a little less than an hour for Q&A. So I'm going to start with the question about technology, which is what technology barriers have prevented connectivity of the next billion? I think that it was alluded to that we have very advanced technologies from the second generation on, but they're not necessarily technologies aimed at connecting the next billion. So what are the technical barriers to connect everybody or the next billion or the next several billion, and how can we overcome those barriers? And I'm going to throw that out to all of the panelists, so feel free to jump in with your thoughts on that question. No comments? I can call on people. Let me call on Edward. Go ahead.
Thanks, Andrea. Well, I was going to say we've done quite a bit of work looking at wireless backhaul specifically to target very rural and remote areas. And there it's really challenging. Most of the existing solutions rely very much on line of sight. I think we can talk in very kind of high academic terms about the technical barriers for how we deploy that. But actually, in many of the countries that we're focusing on, the reality of kind of doing this on the ground is that we're trying to deploy, relay towers in incredibly remote areas. Maybe it's only a dirt track most of the year. Maybe it's flooded a lot of the time. We then need to haul all of the actual materials up to the very top of the inaccessible hill in order for us to actually deliver the system which can connect those 10,000 people that maybe maybe they might be 40 or 50 kilometers away from a fiber pop, and therefore we need to have some sort of relay tower in the middle. And there are obviously kind of technical barriers within that, but a lot of the time, as I kind of emphasized before, it's the kind of very boring civil engineering costs that end up blowing the whole thing to the point where it's unviable, essentially. And obviously, I think there are big developments, which Ken and others can talk about in trying to provide new forms of connectivity for backhaul, but definitely we've encountered those kind of traditional cost factors as being significant barriers.
Any other panelists want to weigh in on this question? Because certainly for the academic community like me, we would love to know, we're like hammers looking for nails. What are the technical barriers? Let's overcome them. Any of the other panelists want to speak out about technical barriers or things that research and academia can help in breaking down?
Andrea, I'll share some thoughts. I think it's interesting to just consider the sort of topics and even the name of this event. When we consider that the next major G, 6G, will begin to emerge in this next decade, it creates an interesting sort of challenge for markets and regions that are difficult to serve, whether it be the economic factors that define underdeveloped regions, or the deployment cost challenges that were just commented on. When an industry like the telecommunications industry tools up to take on the next major challenge of today, it's 5G. When 6G comes, there will be this tremendous sort of vacuum of funding and energy, and all the creativity of all the companies that are represented in this will be focused on that. And it creates a particular challenge to now say, what do we have left as a community, as an industry? What do we have left to go focus on the undeveloped regions where connectivity is such a challenge? To associate connecting the unconnected with 6G is in a large sense an initial burden, because the vacuum that 6G development will take will really make it even more of a challenge. So to address connecting the unconnected. So one of the challenges that I think we have already begun to consider and need to consider going forward is, how do we architect networks in such a way that let's say that when 6G is being deployed in highly developed regions in Europe and Asia and North America, that those same networks can allow for efficient reuse of legacy technologies that still have the potential to address the connectivity challenges in areas where right now they don't really care about 6G. They don't even know what the G means, right? They just want to connect to the internet, or they just want to make a phone call. So finding a way to get out of this, I'm going to retire the last G and focus all of my energies on the next G, that really does a disservice. That mentality as an industry does a disservice for the areas that really don't care about the G. They just want to have connectivity. So I think that's something that we've got to face as an industry.
Yeah, it's an excellent point that, the way the cellular systems have evolved, and same with Wi-Fi, is all about what's the newest, greatest thing. How do we get higher data rates? How do we get better performance? Whereas, in many cases, 2G is sufficient for connectivity in parts of the world where there isn't any. That's a very cheap technology. A lot of those base stations and phones are sitting in landfills. And what if we could actually tap some of those? Would that be a better way to go about connecting the next billion versus coming up with the new G, which is going to need, newer technology and newer capabilities? It's a great point. Anybody else want to comment on the technical barriers before I move to the next question?
I'll toss one in there, and I think software is a really, really big and important factor that I'll note. There's kind of a disconnect that remains between the pace of software innovation and the way software is written between web hyperscalers and startups in the telecom industry. In large, software in traditional telecom industry is it's still a world where software updates are things that are looked at with fear. Software becomes trusted because of it's been production proven and how long it's operated in a deployed network. And I think that's something that still kind of acts at times to increase costs artificially and somewhat limit the pace of innovation in that industry. So I think even the cultural change and kind of I don't know, maybe blending of that industry with some of the other best practices that are happening is one area that would help a lot.
Super. Thanks so much. Okay, so I'm going to turn to one of the audience questions. And again, I encourage the audience to continue to send in your questions. This one is about regulatory challenges. So not only are there regulatory changes potentially needed for 5G satellite communication, but there's a whole host of regulatory issues from, can I put a small cell in a downtown area? What is the regulatory aspects of the interplay between terrestrial and satellite systems? Spectrum is another big piece of regulation. So I'm going to start with Helka, and because certainly you know a lot about the standardization and regulation associated with satellites, but feel free to talk more broadly about the regulatory challenges of connecting the next billion, and then I'll open it up to other panelists as well if you have remarks on that. So Helka, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. So in 3GPP for release 17 for the 5G, we are not trying to change the regulatories because there's simply not enough time. The releases are quite short. So we are taking just feedback, what does the standard needs to adapt to? And if there's like a regulatory change is needed, then that will come up once those are start to be deployed, and there's really like we really see in practice which regulatory requirements versus the standard really does not work in practice. So what we currently have is that the UE needs to be served within a country where it is. And this is like the most basic regulatory aspect that we are considering in 3GPP. So it means that the network needs to know where the UE is. Within the network, the UE location is typically told by the cell ID where the UE is connected. And this is based on the terrestrial system where the cell IDs are decent size. So you can say that if the UE is in terrestrial cell something, it is in the area of like say 100 kilometers. But if the satellite cell is like something like 500 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers, that doesn't work. So then in a bit fluffy way, the specifications just say that it has to be comparable to terrestrial. Your network needs to know where the UE is. But then what does it mean in practice? Does it mean in practice that when the satellites are deployed, the cells need to be small? They need to follow the country borders? It really, all that comes in daylight when this really starts to build those systems. But the first release just has to obey those country border regulations, and maybe going forward, there could be more like collaboration among the different countries' regulations that they could maybe make some rules for satellite communications to make some relaxations there. And the other thing is that whether can the network trust the UE reported GNSS location or not, in addition to the cell location, or how does the network can verify where the UE actually is if the cell ID is not enough? A lot of open questions. We have spent so much time in these discussions and trying to find out what would work and how to sort of go on. And the standardizations, given all these quite strict.
Do Do you see that somehow a change in the mindset of regulation or the regulators is needed, or do you think there is a path to getting these new regulations in place?
We are not, because we are not really interacting with the regulation, so we don't know their mindset. We have just got some feedback, and it's that they are just saying to us how things are, and we try to make the standards to be compliant. Because if the release is year and a half long, there's not time to ask a question and wait for the response and then make all the design. We have to make a design. There's so many just the connection related issues that we just need to work on. Also, this sort of communication with the regulations is just on top, and we have maybe got one response on SA3LI that just has stated to us how things are. But the actual sort of two-way communication, I think it will continue, and that will take time. The similar issue is with the aerials and with other things.
Great. So I want to open it up. I mean, especially because we have such an incredibly broad perspective of our panelists collectively about this regulatory issue. I mean, how do the rest of you see this? What are the barriers? How do we break through them? And so please, Brian, Edward, Ken, jump in with your own thoughts on this.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here, kind of to address some things regulatory could help with for connecting the unconnected. That's maybe a little unrelated to satellites and high altitude platforms. Is the shared broadband spectrum, like CBRS spectrum that we have in North America, isn't something that's widely adopted worldwide. So for those that aren't familiar with that spectrum, what it is it's some 3.5 gigahertz spectrum that's very convenient for use for direct to handset communication with cellular networks. That's available for anyone to use. You don't have to be a network operator. You don't have to pay for the spectrum at an auction. Anyone can use it. Initially, I think it was envisioned that enterprises or maybe academic campuses might use this spectrum for kind of outdoor wireless networks. But for anyone that's not familiar with it, I'd like to encourage them to check out a network called Helium. That's a crypto blockchain-based network that's using now this spectrum to make 5G small cells out of people's houses, let them put a small hotspot connected to their residential broadband network, create a 5G bubble out of their house, and kind of monetize their real estate and its ability to offload capacity off of other macro cell towers as a way to earn revenue and mine a token in a crypto blockchain. So instead of burning electricity to mine a crypto coin, you're actually connecting the unconnected to mine a crypto coin. And it's a network that can operate without any large scale corporate network operator. And they can actually federate and integrate with them. So I think that's a really promising technology, and that network's expanding very rapidly at the moment, but it's something that's only possible if other countries around the world adopt a spectrum policy that allows for this kind of shared access spectrum from individuals.
Great. Anyone else on the regulatory challenges?
Could I just quickly talk about infrastructure sharing, Andrea? So
sure,
this is a key issue in 5G, and that's because the revenues in 5G have been static or declining, or more broadly in cellular networks, for a number of years. So obviously there's been a big emphasis on, okay, can we share more infrastructure? I think the real issue is that if you speak to an economist, when they talk about how the market should be regulated, they're going to emphasize competition. But then obviously within the kind of the 5G more engineering sphere, we've been looking at passive infrastructure sharing, so the civil engineering part, or active infrastructure sharing, the actual electronics, or shared rural networks, or even just a network as a service, which is starting to become something that could be possible. And here we have this trade-off, which is that economists want more competition, but then there's more of a press to kind of ease this a bit and basically allow more infrastructure sharing. And this is something which I don't think we've solved yet, but is going to cause a lot of headaches for regulators over the coming years.
When you talk about infrastructure sharing, is that across different carriers, like the base stations that they have, or what that's what you mean? Yeah. And we only have a few carriers in the US, which is a challenge, but perhaps satellites coming in will change that picture a little bit. But I guess that remains to be seen, and that's also a regulatory issue, as Helka pointed out. Anyone else want to comment on regulatory issues before we move to the next question? Okay, so we talked about this a little bit. The next question is really about economics. How do we fund the development of the infrastructure to connect the next billion? Where is the money going to come from? How do we, every commercial companies are about making money. So if there isn't money to be made in connecting the next billion, it won't come from companies. Again, if governments don't have the resources to do it or the desire to do it, it won't come from government. So how do we financially enable connectivity of the next billion? I think that's as big a challenge as the technology ones, because frankly, we could connect everybody in rural America by putting up large base stations with wide coverage. Maybe with the 2G radio. We're not doing that because it's not financially beneficial to the carriers to do that right now. In other parts of the world, it's even more complicated. So what are the financial barriers, the economic barriers that have prevented us from connecting the next billion up until now? And what is changing? And I think it's really interesting when you look at a company like Facebook or Alphabet that are investing in this kind of connectivity. Obviously, these are for-profit companies. So what is the motivation to do so? And is that the way to connect the next billion economically, that's economically viable? So I'll open the floor to everybody. I would hope all the panelists might have something to say about this issue, which is certainly a burning one for me.
I'll start out. So I think one thing that like at least we're doing at Facebook Connectivity to try to make the build out of access in markets that otherwise don't have economic incentives is to reduce the total cost of ownership of access networks for network operators, both in terms of operational expenses, but also the upfront capital required to build them. So I'll start out with an example that relates to a project that I work on. So if someone wants to build a new cellular network in a region, let's say of an emerging market, where there might be enough population density, that you would think there should be a cell network, but there's not. Often it's because there's a few $100,000 US of upfront expense to build some servers for the cellular packet core that have to go somewhere in the city. And then you have to probably install some software or buy an appliance from one of 3 or 4 large companies that tend to have the consolidation of the cellular infrastructure. And you procure this stuff on a bet that as you build out cell towers in these villages, you'll eventually use all the capacity of your big investment that you've started out with, for maybe $500,000 in total. One thing we can do as a company is we've invested in building open source software that is a scale out model instead of a scale up. So you can start with a single cell network for an upfront investment of just $200 and start building a cell network and monetizing it. And so giving away these tools can actually be economically beneficial for a company like Facebook, because the software engineers and their time that we invest in building this open source technology and this new sort of cellular network architecture can kind of unlock the economical build out of these cellular networks in rural markets, put a lot more people online, and then that benefits a lot of companies that have their business built around connecting people in the world.
Super. Ken, I'm going to ask you to comment on this, given your work in Loon and Alphabet and Google before that.
Happy to, Andrea. I think if the answer to this challenge were easy, we wouldn't be having this discussion, right? So to promote more ubiquitous connectivity is, in my opinion, going to take a portfolio of solutions, some technical, some economic. But let me talk a little bit about how HAPS can be part of that portfolio of solutions. Edward correctly talked about some of the sort of infrastructure investments that are needed to deploy a traditional terrestrial base station. You need power, you need backhaul on the ground, you need a cement pad, you need a tower or a building. There's a lot of very significant site costs that, with the reduction of cost associated with the electronics itself, these site costs dominate the total cost of ownership of a terrestrial base station. One of the things that getting off the surface of the Earth, whether you stop at the stratosphere or you go all the way to orbiting satellites, is you can change that economic equation significantly with respect to these types of costs. And when you consider that by virtue of getting at higher and higher altitudes, you have the capability now to effectively provide coverage to a very wide area, you're not only eliminating all these site costs for a single traditional tower, you theoretically could be eliminating these site costs for hundreds, what would otherwise be hundreds of traditional terrestrial site deployments. So HAPS, of course, will have its own set of economic and technical challenges, but one of the big advantages is to, in a very flexible and time-efficient manner, to put a small network of HAPS over an area that otherwise would be impractical to cover with traditional terrestrial cell towers, and now without having to incur all of those costs, you can now illuminate wide areas that otherwise would be impractical to do so.
Helka, I'd love to hear the Ericsson perspective, because it's very different from a Google or a Facebook, which are kind of the people that, or the companies that sit at the top of the network. Ericsson is building the network. So what do you think in terms of these economics?
Thank you. So I can say a few items on this. So one thing is that if the cell is very large, and especially if the cell uses the old waveforms like 2G or 3G, the capacity and number of the users that kind of cell can actually serve is very, very limited. So when 4G started to use the off-DM waveform, the time, frequency, resource allocation, and how many more users you can serve the same frequency band and same time unit increased a lot. But still, there's limitations what the certain size of a cell, how many UEs you can serve there, simply because the paging capacity, the initial access capacity is limited by the signaling. So when we have these large NTN cells, they can actually only serve a very limited amount of UEs. So if you want to serve those places where you have a lot of UEs, you need to have the terrestrial network. So networks are very good in these remote areas where there's some UEs and they are spread in a wide area. So there the satellites fit there perfectly. But one cost issue there is also that the initial development of the satellite system is quite expensive, because you have to launch something in the space, and then if you want to make changes, you launch again. And so these kind of iterations and the initial test is going to cost. So if we get past that step, got some funding there, then maybe going forward it would actually make sense economically to actually serve wide areas. with LEO satellites or GEO satellites, we consider in principle both LEO and GEO. We actually concentrate mostly on these different LEO options. I just answered the other question I saw there.
Right.
And the other thing is also that the UEs, that if you have 40 UEs and you have a manufacturer for 40 UEs that builds a lot of those, so if you can use the same UE in city and in those remote areas, is of course better than buying a 2G phones that nobody even manufactures anymore and only use it there, and then you need to have another UE.
Yeah, I mean that is a problem of going backwards in technology, as there isn't support for it. It's hard to buy them. They're not maintained.
Andrea, could I quickly respond to what Helka just said with regard to capacity? I think there's a lesson that we've learned with terrestrial networks that we should be mindful of when we think about how non-terrestrial networks can fit into this heterogeneous multi-altitude network that we're imagining. From the day there was cellular, there was the notion of cell splitting. When you needed more capacity, you put in more cells. A decade or two later, we came up with small cells that were now more physically optimized to facilitate cell splitting when capacity demands dictated that there should be more base stations. That notion very logically applies to a heterogeneous network comprised of space, sky, and terrestrial assets. We shouldn't think that an undeveloped remote area that might be appropriate for a satellite coverage solution today will always be a satellite covered area. We instead should imagine that in areas that are impractical to deploy terrestrial networks, that if we have space and sky, if we have LEO satellites and HAPS solutions that might be right for that particular area today, well, tomorrow or next year or next decade, as that area develops, it might be now commercially logical for a terrestrial mobile network operator to do a terrestrial deployment. So we need to get out of the mindset of we implement a solution once. We should be thinking about evolutions of networks.
That's excellent. Go ahead.
I was just wanting to talk about this practical, because from the technical perspective, the UEs need to be separated. So large cell can only distinguish a number of UEs, just because, first of all, there's now random sequences to distinguish UEs is a limited amount. But it goes exactly how you said, that if you first would build a large cell, if there's not many users, but if there's to be more users, then it makes sense to build a terrestrial network with smaller cells that can actually serve all those UEs, because the large cell cannot serve just so large amount of UEs because of these practical technical limitations. Yeah.
So I want to kind of pick up on this discussion and also merge a few of the questions here. And by the way, please, your questions are wonderful. Please keep them coming. We have about a little less than about 20 minutes for the rest of the Q&A. And I want to give the panelists time for a closing remark. So we've touched on the notion that, there's terrestrial networks. We started out with macro cells, then the cells got smaller to add capacity. And now we're looking at these space-based networks, whether it's the high altitude platform, which is below satellites. There's low Earth orbit, LEOs, which is what Iridium was, which failed. You even have, medium Earth orbits and geosynchronous satellites that are really only about downloads. They're not good for delay constrained applications. And so the question that I think is really interesting from the audience is, how do you think today, I mean, Ken's point is very good that things will evolve, but today, how do you think about those different types of connectivity, given the economics of them, given the challenges of deploying satellites, given the challenge of deploying terrestrial networks for different areas of the globe with different economic considerations? So how do we fit together these different types of networks to serve everybody? Or which type of network, whether it's a LEO or a high altitude platform or a terrestrial network for parts of the globe that today are not connected?
I'll jump in here. I think of them as highly related to population density in the graph and the map that I showed in my opening remarks. The first thing I want to dispel is anyone in the audience that might be thinking because, say, SpaceX Starlink is coming online, the problem of global connectivity is solved. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. And if you actually just do the math on how much capacity the largest LEO mega constellation can put down, you'll find that it's a couple of megabits per second per square kilometer, right? So that makes it an excellent solution when you take the population in an area and the people that can afford a couple $100 or a couple $1,000, depending on the price point they reach, of the user terminal to put on their roof. And those economics make sense. But there's a lot of places on Earth that are unconnected and have many hundreds of people per square kilometer, where that's just not enough capacity. And so the way I think of solving for those regions is that you actually need lower altitude solutions than even LEO, whether they're going to be much more economically deployable, like large macro cell base stations, or they're high altitude platforms, or a combination thereof, to support those kind of medium density unconnected markets. And then there's people where really mobile connectivity from LEO or mid-Earth orbit or geostationary orbit direct to their handset will be the most economical solution, because it frees them from the large investment of the terminal that they have to put on their roof. So there's no one solution, and I think altitude is often a way to trade off for population density.
Other comments from the panelists on this? You know, where does a high altitude platform fit in economically and technically? Where does a LEO fit in economically and technically? Where should we build terrestrial networks where there aren't them now for technical and economic reasons? Any other comments about that? Maybe your particular passion for which platform you care about the most, or you think is going to be the most important one for connecting the next billion?
I'll just add to what Brian said and refer back to my earlier comments. We both, Brian and I, have both talked about a combination of solutions, and population density versus altitude is a very convenient way to think about it. We've also talked today about evolution of the standards from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 and soon 6G. We ought to also think that even within an area with a particular population density, that the right network topology to bring that area, let's say 4G today, might not be the right topology to bring it 5G. We might imagine, very much in the way that we think about macro cells and small cells, we might imagine that a given area is receiving its 3G or its 4G with terrestrial today, but it might be most logical economically to provide 4G or 5G in that very same area with a higher altitude solution, because the demands on that particular technology, whether it be as a function of handset availability or other factors, might not dictate that that particular region should be served with all of the network technologies 3, 4, 5, 6G in the same way. We should imagine that can be different, and each of those can evolve with time.
Could I just add that we've just published a paper in IEEE which looked at an open source assessment of the three of the main LEO constellations, which are basically either in being launched now or will in the future. So Starlink, OneWeb, and potentially in the future also Kuiper. So what we basically learned from that was each asset obviously has very large capacity. It could be up to 20 gigabit per second per asset, but even with a density of say 5,500 cells, you might be then still serving something like 90 to 100,000 square kilometers. So even small adoption rates start to saturate that capacity that's available. And we had some quality of service assumptions built within that, but we basically took away this kind of key statistic that in order for it to compete with terrestrial solutions, you need to keep the user density basically below 1 user per 10 square kilometers.
Yeah, and I think that emphasizes also the earlier comment about thinking about these different altitudes as associated with capacity and user density. And I think that we've known for a long time that big cells have smaller capacity per user and small cells have more capacity per user. You know, I wrote a paper on that actually with Slim Aluini. It was one of the first papers that I wrote as a professor with my brilliant first student Slim about, you know, shrinking cells gives us more capacity. And now we're in a world where we're not so focused on capacity, we're focused on connectivity. And that means we need to, you know, make the cells bigger. And that's why we're moving to these higher orbits. I guess another interesting question, I have so many interesting questions that are coming in. One is just, you know, satellites, you think about Iridium, they were not a commercial success. The high altitude platforms have not yet been a commercial success. What will be different about them this time? Or is it that commercial success is not what's going to enable them? They're going to be funded in other
Well, I'll go quickly, Andrea. I think the funded in other ways question needs to be confronted by society, for sure. I like what Edward said at the start about how radio regulatory agencies collect all this spectral auction money and then turn around and give it to their colleagues who are charged with other social initiatives. I think society needs to confront that question, but certainly we need to ask the question, can a high altitude platform or a satellite network be profitable? The cost models are very different. It is true that to date, HAPS networks have not been commercially successful in a wide scale. But I think it's important to sort of consider the trajectory. We have gone in the last decade talking about HAPS now from a complete science fiction proposition to technologies developed by many companies, and several mobile network operators have conducted trials or actually deployed high altitude technologies. They have yet to reach scale, but the trajectory, I think, is very encouraging. And I think in many cases, patience is a virtue. So let's not be too quick to conclude whether it's been successful or not.
Any other comments? Okay, so I have time for maybe one or two questions. The first one, I hope I'll get to two of them and then we'll do wrap up. So next one is, suppose we could connect the next billion or the next 3 billion. What would they do with that connectivity?
Yeah, well, I in my opening remarks, I tried to note some statistics on what people do when they get connected. They don't have connectivity today. I think a lot of them use it to learn about job prospects, to figure out when to plant crops, when to how to connect with loved ones and communicate. I'll also note that like a lot of people who we list as unconnected are unconnected most of the time. They may even live somewhere without electricity, but the lengths people go to today to get connectivity periodically for their jobs is quite interesting. I think we spent a lot of time in Lund studying different markets and having our UX research team kind of come back and make sure that those of us living in Silicon Valley and trying to design solutions for the world really understand what the life is like for someone that is unconnected. And one of the things we came to understand is there's places in the world where people will spend hours commuting just to reach a place with connectivity and dispatch a bunch of queued emails or messages and receive emails for the day, and then travels hours back to their village. And so I think a lot of these people that we're talking about connecting are people who are connected occasionally and rarely, and they know quite well what they would do with the connectivity if they had it abundantly and affordably.
Thanks so much. That's wonderful insight. Any other comments on this?
Quick thought, Andrea. We always think of the unconnected as the opportunity is for them to be connected, which I absolutely believe it is true. But there's also an opportunity for the rest of us. One of the things for others to be connected, and I don't know that this changes in any way the fundamental cost factors. But again, when we get back to these societal questions of how do we fund connectivity initiatives, let's also recognize that we, the connected, will be better off if we can hear from all voices. And I think that's something that's very important, very fundamental to Brian, his company's initiative around community, right? So it's connecting the unconnected is not simply a service for the unconnected. It's a service for all of us.
That's such a beautiful thought. For me, someone who's championed diversity and inclusion in the technical fields, I know that diverse ideas and perspectives make every organization better, make every project better, make out of the box thinking better. And so if we could only hear from those 3 billion, how much would that make the world a better place? I think that's such an important point, and really a lot of the focus of the Marconi Society in that connectivity. Anybody else want to weigh in on this question? What will people do with the connectivity? You know, in some ways, if you think back to when we were building the first cell phones, we had no idea, right? Even the notion of going from analog to digital, it's like, what are they going to do with digital communication? Well, they may send text messages. Certainly, the large number of people in the process of going from 1G to 2G and even 3G, what are they going to do with all that bandwidth? And then the iPhone came around and there were all these apps that nobody thought people would want to watch, you know, cat videos from anywhere, but that's what they did with them, or whatever they wanted to do with it. So I think the beauty of connectivity for all, we don't need to predict necessarily what people will do with them. If we look at the history of connectivity, it's clear that connecting people to the internet, to each other, leads to incredible opportunities and thought experiments and innovation that we can't even imagine today. I won't ask this question because I want to leave time for the closing comments, but one of the comments was about electricity. I think Brian touched on that. You know, even if we have 3 billion people that are unconnected, but we have 1 billion without electricity, and that's not even taking into account the fragility of the electric grid in first world countries, which we've seen in the US quite dramatically with climate change and other things. So we really need to think about not just how do we connect people over wireless, but also how do we connect them through electricity. And I'll just comment, one of my favorite freshman design projects over the years was a group of students that built a charger that charged a cell phone via bicycling. And the idea was that if you go to a third world country, people use bicycles all the time, and why can't we use the energy of people pedaling their bicycle to create electricity? And maybe that would prevent those hour-long commutes to go and get to a place with connectivity. So I'm gonna give each of the panelists an opportunity to provide just 1 or 2 minutes of closing remarks. I think I'll go in the opposite order of which I started. So Ken, let me put you up to provide a minute or two of closing remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you, Andrea, for doing a great job hosting this, and thanks for all that are participating. We have had some great questions here. Maybe just to underscore something I talked about earlier, sometimes innovation takes years or even decades. The first engineers at AT&T or Motorola that started working on cellular were doing so in 1970, right? And we didn't even see the first commercial network until the early 80s, and then it took another decade before any of us could even imagine a device that looked like this. So let's say it took 20 years to go from conception to what we now think of as mobile communications. The same types of roadmaps will need to be encountered for some of these more advanced communication technologies that we're talking about. And I think it's our collective opportunity as an industry to continue to persevere, to invest where it's sensible to do so, because what seems fantasy today will be reality tomorrow.
Wonderful thought. Helka, you're up next.
Hi, so thank you, Andrea, for hosting, and all the participants. It has been an interesting discussion. Actually, I decided to use these few minutes to responding to this. There was this one very specific question about this GNSS location that's basically what is my topic. So in release 17, the GNSS is required for the UE. And in satellites and systems in general, you will need the UE location if the cell size is larger than the terrestrial cell. So that's just a technical fact. But it doesn't have to be GNSS location. It could be network derived or some other UE location. But that is going to be needed. Without the UE location, you cannot operate in a cells that are very large. But other than that, release 17 is going to close, and we will soon have the first standard. And then after that, we will see who implements, where it's implemented, what does it cost, or maybe we don't know that, but we will know how much the cell phones will cost, but that has the satellite capability. But it would be the same 5G cell phones that can be used then for other things also, but maybe there's this extra category for satellite 5G phones.
Thank you so much, and thanks for responding to that question. It was quite technical, so I'm glad that. Edward, you're up next.
So I think I'm just going to close by saying that there are three sets of decisions that governments need to consider. So the first are basically the technologies which they kind of want to encourage to deploy. So which generation, what type of backhaul they should be deploying. The second are the business models. So how much infrastructure sharing we should encourage, for example, in the market. And then finally, it's regulatory and policy decisions. So taxation levels, spectrum license fees, coverage obligations. We found in a recent analysis that if you actually reduce the cost from all of those options and you pick the least cost options, you can reduce the cost for providing universal broadband by up to 2/3. So I think we just need to kind of think about that. We've got a lot of the tools at our disposal already, to be honest. We just need to make sure we're actually making prudent policy decisions which encourage deployment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those wise and thoughtful remarks. And Brian, you get to bring us home with the closing remarks before I wrap up the panel.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andrea, and thanks to everyone for the excellent questions. I think I'll probably close by noting the role that everyone can play in connecting the unconnected. I think until now you might think that the way to participate is to pursue a career in wireless communications or connectivity or access and do it through industry. But one of the most exciting changes right now is the democratization of both internet connectivity infrastructure as well as the networks themselves. And if you're interested in being part of this movement, there's a number of great open source projects that you can participate in. You can check out projects like Magma, Open RAN, Open Air Interface is another great open source project. The Magma project, which is they call the People's Network, a way that everyone can use their home connection to provide connectivity for those around you. and other projects that are out there that you can get involved and help participate. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those wonderful comments. And I just want to say this has been an amazing panel. I've chaired many panels before, and this is one of the most interesting. I think the breadth of the perspectives that all of you have brought to this very challenging question of how do we connect the next billion, and what are the challenges and how do we overcome them? I mean, I learned a lot from listening to all of you. I love the audience questions. Thank you so much for sharing with us the things on your mind about this very challenging question of connecting the next billion. And I also want to say that in addition to being Dean of Engineering at Princeton, I'm also a Marconi board member. And Marconi, in the last year, especially under the leadership of Samantha, has really focused on this notion of digital inclusion. That's what this panel is all about. How do we include everybody? How do we get those voices heard? How do we get them connected so that not only can they benefit from that connectivity, but also how everybody can benefit from bringing in these different voices. So I want to encourage people to continue the conversation, encourage you to check out what's happening in the Marconi Society and ways that you can get involved around digital inclusion, whether you're an engineer or not. And then putting back on my dean hat and my research hat as someone who's incredibly passionate about wireless communication. There's so many challenges that we have that we need to solve through technology as well as other means. So I encourage those of you out there working in wireless. To me, this is the decade of wireless communication. This is the decade where we have the opportunity to solve very challenging problems that we haven't solved before. And for students and others that are listening in, we need you. We need your ideas. We need your technical expertise. We need your breadth of experiences. It's really an all hands on deck, so that at the end of this decade, we will have everybody included, regardless of where they live, regardless of their economic circumstances. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to the Executive Director, Samantha, for some closing remarks. The floor is yours, Samantha.
Thank you, Andrea. Wow. Thank you so much, Andrea, and all of our panelists for that truly excellent session. The insights and perspectives across academia and industry were really fascinating and opened my mind to some new possibilities that are certainly aligned with the Marconi Society's mission of digital inclusion. So if you haven't already, and you're watching this via our streaming channels, I encourage you to register for the full event series at marconisociety.org/decade. And we're going to keep the conversation going by attending our next session, which is next week, October 5th, and it's going to be focused on digital equity and security on the internet. So we have a really great panel with some global perspectives lined up, moderated by Richard Clegg of the Lloyd's Registry Foundation. So we hope you'll join us again next week. And thank you all for being a part of this conversation.